Hello again, everyone. So now we finally get to the theory of forms. We finally get our answer to this problem about objective truth, right? So we've been worried all along since week 2. Why does Socrates think his project is worthwhile? Why does he think we actually can attain objective knowledge of the truth or of these definitions he thinks exists? And so, as we saw in the allegory of the cave, Plato thought when we finally get to this final step where we're in contemplation of the sun, we see the sun's full role in the world, right? We come to this full, robust understanding. That's supposed to be analogous for us for knowledge of the theory of forms or knowledge of the forms. And so what is the theory of forms? Well, the forms might sound a little strange at first, right? These forms are abstract entities that exist in an immaterial world, but essentially they're the perfect version of everything. And so when we come to a full understanding of piety, so let's go back to the Euthyphro, we're worried about what piety means. We can see, okay, here's a pious action, here's a pious action, here's a pious action, so on and so forth. What do each of those things have in common? What do each of the pious acts have in common? And when we can abstract away and see what all of those things have in common, we're getting pretty close to knowledge of the form, right? We're getting this very general, robust understanding of the meaning of the word. So that's roughly what a form is. It's this immaterial thing that exists in another plane of existence, right? It doesn't exist here on the physical plane with us. It exists somewhere else. And it's the perfect version of whatever form it is. So there's a form for beauty and goodness and justice and piety, so on and so forth. Okay, so let's try and fill in some of the details, right? Because that's probably still pretty vague to you. So what are the forms? And here's where you can start filling in your little cheat sheet down below the video. So what are the forms? Well, they're not actually a concept, but they're pretty similar to a concept. So when we think of concepts, so I have a concept of chair, I have a concept of apples, I have a concept of every other object, right? So how do I get a concept? Well, it's not just I saw a single chair and then formed my concept of a chair, right? I saw a bunch of individual chairs, noticed that they all share some things in common, right? They all have legs, a place for me to sit, and a back to lean into, right? If it doesn't have the back, then it's a stool. For the chair, it doesn't have to rock, it doesn't have to spin, right? It's made for a single person to sit with back support, so on and so forth, right? You get the general idea. And so I form my concept of a chair, and so now that I have this concept in my head, I can look around the world and say, hey, that fits my concept, that chair fits my concept, all of these different objects fit my concept of a chair. We do the same thing with something like the concept of an apple, right? So we start off by seeing a bunch of different apples. We see all the different colored apples, right? Green, red, and yellow, different shades of red, so on and so forth. And we start to abstract away. Right? So when we abstract, we go from each particular apple to then maybe having the abstract concept of a green apple, a red apple, a yellow apple, and then we can abstract away even further and just get the general concept, apple. Right? And so now we can look around the world and see which things fit that concept. And the forms are pretty similar to that. The forms are sort of like this thing at the top, the concept at the top, right? We have this perfect form of beauty, and then we can see there are beautiful flowers, beautiful people, beautiful pieces of art. And then we go down and we see these particular pieces of art that are beautiful, these particular people that are beautiful, these particular other objects that are beautiful. Right? So it works in a very similar way as a concept. We get to see all these particular things, and when we get to that abstract, robust knowledge at the top, in this immaterial world, which is where it gets a little weird, but it's in this immaterial world where we get the perfect version of it. The reason why it is not a concept is because these things don't just exist in our minds like a concept does. The forms exist in another realm. They exist in this immaterial realm. They do actually exist. Plato thinks they're existing things somewhere else. And they have eternal existence. So they have always existed and will always exist. So in that sense, they're a little different than a concept. Hopefully you can see the difference there. Okay, so we've gotten a general sort of understanding for what you might think the forms are. We got to fill in some more information though. So where are the forms? Well, I've already told you they're immaterial, right? And they don't exist in our plane. But that doesn't give us a lot of information. And if they don't exist in our plane, then how did we ever come into contact with them, right? So Plato thinks we can know the forms. That's how we know our objective truths, because the forms just are objective truth. So how did we ever get in contact with them? Well, Plato thinks that the soul does exist. Right? So the soul exists for Plato, and reincarnation occurs for Plato. So what happens is the soul starts off in this immaterial realm with the forms. And so our soul was in contemplation of the forms. It could see them this whole time. Our soul just sat up there in the material realm looking at the forms and coming to know them. So how did we ever lose objective truth? Well, our body left this immaterial realm and was dragged down to the material world. And why was it dragged down? Well, Plato thinks the soul can be divided into three parts. The reasoning part of the soul, the spirited part of the soul, and the appetitive part of the soul. And the appetitive part of the soul has these desires for material things. And so the appetitive part of the soul was up in the immaterial realm, looked down to the material world, and saw things that it wanted. And that desire slowly dragged it down to the material world. And then, boom, we're embodied, right? And we're dragged out of the immaterial world into the material realm. And Plato thinks this is a traumatic experience, right? So it's traumatic. All of a sudden we find ourselves in this body, and our body has a number of desires that our soul didn't have before. So now we're worried about feeding ourselves. We're worried about thirst, worried about a desire for sex, for enjoyment in our free time, right? Now we have all these bodily material desires that we didn't have before. And so now we have beliefs about what's important and what's good, but they're based on this false sort of information we're getting from the material world. And that material world is essentially like throwing mud all over your perfect knowledge, right? You had all this perfect preserved knowledge. I don't know, let's picture it this way. You have all this perfect preserved knowledge, then you get embodied. Boom, now it's covered up by the mud of the material world. So the forms clearly exist. They exist in this other realm where we have existed before. And the reason why we forgot what objective truth is because we've been covering up that knowledge when our appetitive part of the soul brought us down to the material world. Okay, so what are the forms? We've already covered that. They're like a concept, but not. And then I gave you all that information. Where are they? They exist in this immaterial realm where our soul used to be. So that's really important. You have to know for Plato's theory to work, you have to be able to believe in the existence of a soul. And that we can know objective truth because we've always known it. Right? It's not like we are coming to discover it as embodied people. It's that we already have this knowledge, and now we're just going to clear that mud off, right? We're going to get rid of all the misunderstanding, and we're going to get back to the perfect knowledge we had when we were just a soul sitting up there in the contemplation of the forms. Okay, so how do they relate to particular objects, right? So you should be worried now, thinking about this theory. I know roughly what a form is and how it exists, but if it's really just the abstract version of all these particular things in the world, but all the particular things are material and the form is immaterial, how do they interact with one another? How do they relate to each other? And here it's not clear, right? So Plato gives us a number of different answers throughout the dialogues. At one point, he says the forms cause the particulars to exist, right? So he doesn't give us details on the process, but roughly the idea is that these particular imperfect things exist in the real world because the perfect immaterial forms cause them to exist. It could also be the particulars participate in the form. What could that mean? In some sense, the particular is participating in the form because it is sort of embodying part of the form's overall essence, right? So we have the abstract form, immaterial form of beauty, which is the most perfect, perfect form for beauty, right? And the particular things are all beautiful, but clearly lacking when they're compared to the perfect form. And so they're participating in beauty, although they aren't this perfect sense of beauty. And then finally, there is this idea that the particulars we see in the world are just faint, imperfect copies of the forms, right? So imagine God's up there, and he has a pretty, for some reason, he hasn't upgraded his tech in a long time, and he has a pretty crappy copier from the 60s, right? And so he takes the perfect triangle form, puts it on the copier, and sends real triangles out, particular triangles out into the world. But because his copier is so old, they come out a little smudged. They come out missing little chunks, right? Some are darker on one edge, lighter on another, right? So we start to get imperfect versions because they're just copies of the pure, perfect form, and any copy can't be as good as the original. Is supposed to be the idea. So now that's supposed to be how they relate to one another. And I think we'll save the next two for the next video. So, because we're running a little short on time here. So hopefully you see now what the forms are, where they are, how they relate to the particular objects we see in the world, and then hopefully you're starting to see how they fill out the question we've been asking this whole time. Right? So hopefully you're starting to see that now we can answer or fill in Socrates' theory. How did Socrates know that there were objective things? Well, because Socrates' soul was at one point in contemplation of these things. For all of us, all of our souls at one time had perfect knowledge. Right? Our souls existed in the realm of the forms. We did nothing but sort of sit there and think of the forms all day. We had a full understanding. The reason why things are so difficult for us now is because that appetitive part of the soul brought us down to the material world and covered us up with all these new beliefs about what's important. But really, they aren't that important. They're all just these material beliefs that the body needs, and we need to clear those away to get back to our perfect knowledge we once had. Okay, so we'll finish our discussion of the forms in the next video. Okay, thank you.